Allison, and special thanks to Jackie and Mona and the rest of the team at the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network for making this possible and for providing a forum for engagement on such important issues as the one that we're going to talk about today. My name is Bill Dempster with 360 Public Affairs and a regular host of these webinars, including the previous two that Allison you referred to. In the past, we went through what was going to happen. We actually had some experts, including a previous executive director of the Federal Patented Review Board, Patented Medicines Review Board, and others speak. And we had one patient representative at the last webinar as well. However, this time we thought it would be a good idea, now that we have draft regulations and something on the table to really look at, let's get the patient voice and perspective back. And this is a very important time, and you'll see why once we get started. So I'll introduce our panelists in just a second, but I want to give a little bit of level setting. This won't take more than 10 minutes. We are going to leave 15 minutes at the end for Q's and A's. So please come up with some of your interesting questions for our panelists or me, and we'll do our best to get to them. And if we don't get to all of them today, we keep the list anyway, and you're going to see some opportunity to email us, and we can follow up with you. So with that, let's get started. Just a little level set on the PMPRB. It's acronym soup, Patented Medicine Prices Review Board. It's a federal quasi-judicial agency that regulates medication prices that are under patent. So this is a patent is given to a manufacturer of a medicine. They've got 20 years in which to work that patent. Usually they have a lower period of time to actually have only their product on the market. But that's the jurisdiction that the PMPRB has. The board reports to the federal health minister, and it does two things. It has a regulatory mandate to ensure that prices for patented medicines are not excessive, quote unquote. And second, a reporting mandate, and they track and analyze pricing trends, not just for patented medicines, but also for generics and other drugs. And they also track research and development spending by manufacturers. And what they do is they classify medicines based on levels of therapeutic improvement, and they regulate the price that comes out of the factory, not what the consumer price actually is, which is often the subject of markups and wholesaler and distribution prices as well. And they're like a traffic cop. They're at the side of the road. If you're speeding, they can pull you over and say you need to actually pay back into the government more because your price was too excessive. You don't, as a manufacturer, you don't need to get approval. You just have to make sure that you're not speeding, and that's I think something that we need to keep in mind. So when the PMPRB was created and put into place in the late 1980s, it was really the only organization reviewing drug prices to any great extent. And it was a pretty quick path from the drug development. You got Health Canada review and authorization. You got past the speeding cop, which was the PMPRB, and then it was pretty straightforward to be listed or get reimbursement from public or private plans, or even just to go to the pharmacy yourself and pay for the prescription that you've been given by the physician. Now, so much has changed since the late 1980s, and there are many different layers of evaluation and decision making that go right down to hospitals, to the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. And I'm not going to go into any of these because we've done so in other webinars. But just to say that each one of these review stages, between when the drug is developed all the way down to patient access, you can blow out into a very complex formula and stepwise approach. And their patients, fortunately, have an opportunity these days to have input on each of these stages. But the point is, this is not the straightforward access that we had in the late 1980s, and for a variety of reasons, which again we've gone through on other webinars. But that's the reality of today. The other reality of today, and this is actually for the last 30 years, all of the prices around the world for medicines are often referenced by other jurisdictions. And so when a manufacturer comes to market in Canada, they want to be careful because Brazil or Mexico is actually referencing the Canadian list or public price. And so that tends to create pricing bands among developed countries that are referencing each other. And as you can see, some of these graphics show the kind of interrelated nature of the public list prices. So I'll just keep on going because this was explained in more detail in previous webinars, but I wanted people to keep that in mind. So the pricing tests that are applied now, they look at the level of therapeutic or clinical improvement. They apply different types of price tests based on the median of the international price, and over on the right you can see flags. They actually apply different formulas to say if you're at the median of the price of these countries, then you're okay. There is one golden rule, and that's the one for all patented medicines. Today, you can't exceed the maximum, the international maximum price, and often that's the price that's available in the United States. That's what people call the golden rule. Price regulations also monitored by the PMPRB. There's regular reporting obligations by the manufacturers, and the maximum allowable price is set at launch. Their first, you come out and your first sale in Canada, you report that back, and then they will determine if you've been speeding or not. Annual price increases are limited to the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, in terms of inflation. Although in the past 30 years, they have rarely actually hit that number. And in fact, this past year, prices dropped on average by 0.5%. There are regular reporting requirements by manufacturers, and they look at different market segments. There's enforcement, investigations, non-compliance options are within the board level, and most often there's a voluntary undertaking by the manufacturer if they've been, again, speeding, sort of to use the analogy, but they will pay that back. In very rare cases, they will go to federal court to challenge what would be a board order to repay for non-compliance of the Patent Act and the patented medicine regulations. So, speaking of regulations, the board operates as part. It's a creature of the Patent Act, and there are regulations called the Patented Medicine Regulations that are under the Patent Act, and there are major changes that are being developed for those. First, and then I'll quickly touch on 5, and then we're going to really drill down on 2 of them. There are 3 new factors as criteria for price evaluation. So pharmacoeconomic evaluations that use the quality stands for quality adjusted life year threshold to be included in the guidelines. So that's an expectation that there will be some kind of reference to how much life we're actually buying versus the standard of care. The second is the size of the market, the expected number of patients that are going to be able to use the product in the coming years. The third is the gross domestic product in Canada, both nationally and on a per capita basis. And the board is trying to, I shouldn't say the board, Health Canada is trying to give the board tools to evaluate willingness to pay. How much can Canadians afford to actually pay for a new drug? The second is a requirement to report for manufacturers to support those new factors. There's a revised list of comparator countries, and we'll go into that in more detail later. There's information on discounts and rebates. And finally, no active monitoring of patented generics. And so if you're generic, but you have a patent sort of attached to it, but there are multiple potential sources of that medicine, then they're not going to be actively requiring reporting from those. I think something that's important. There was some consultations on a discussion paper in May and June last year, and there were over 100 submissions, but there really weren't any substantial changes made, or any changes that we could really see in response to many of those submissions that were put in. And again, I'll let our guests go into that. List of comparator countries. Today, this is the current list. They're proposing to remove Switzerland and the United States from that basket of comparator countries, and they're going to add a bunch of others, including Belgium, Norway, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Netherlands, and Spain. So far, so good. I think I'm rushing because I want to get to the next meat of what Louise and Martine are going to go into. You remember my flow chart earlier where I said each one of those evaluation boxes could be blown out into a separate flow chart? Well, at the PMPRB level, there is a discussion framework, guideline, way that they would potentially use these new criteria and these new requirements. And this is what it looks like. And there will be consultations on this as well. It is relatively complicated, and there's so many questions that are at each stage of a potential way to review each of these new criteria. So I just wanted to show that really quickly. The timeline for regulation development, I'll just point to the UR here. This goes back, in this case, in the timeline, back to May of last year, but really this modernization has been underway for a couple of years before that. We're in the tail end of a 75-day consultation period on the technical regulations. A lot of the meat on how they're going to be used is going to be part of guideline discussions. And then there's an aim to get these implemented for January 1st, 2019. So we don't know what 2018 is going to look like, but it is going to be really busy. And I'm hoping that everyone around this call will have an opportunity to be involved in this. So with that, I'm going to introduce our two panelists. We are so lucky to have Martine Elias with Myeloma Canada, who's going to kick it off, and Louise Binder with us, who many of you already know. Myeloma Canada and Louise with Save Your Skin, and also very involved in many other coalitions. And you were the driving force behind a 17-member coalition submission, and you're right in the middle of writing a new one. So take it away, Martine. I'll advance the slides.
Thank you, Bill. Why should patient care? That's a really good question, because on the surface, when I talk to patients, they say, well, that's a good thing, that drug prices would be lowered. Yes, it sounds really good, but you really have to look at the regulation. What are the implications, and what does that mean? And sometimes it's not necessarily a good thing for patients. So let me put this into context. Bill has gone through a lot of the information with regards to PMPRB, the different levels. But let's understand where this is coming from. Healthcare jurisdiction in Canada is divided between the feds and the provinces. So question right now, the federals are approving drugs and they're regulating price, and then it goes to the provinces for reimbursement. So what the feds are proposing is something that will have a big impact on provinces and territories. So let me tell you how. So funding under the Canada Health Act is that they would transfer money to the provinces to make sure there's enough money to operate hospital and doctors, because the federal jurisdiction under the Federal Health Act is to mandate doctors and hospitals, not at all about drugs. Drugs are provided by the provinces. So Health Canada approves the drugs for launch in Canada so that to be sold, and their Patent Act is there to regulate the prices. So coverage actually falls under the reimbursement, under the provincial jurisdiction. So if you live in Ontario, it would be the Ontario Drug Plan that will cover your drug if you're under a public drug plan. And companies actually have to work with each of the provinces to ensure their drugs are funded. There's another layer that involves negotiating the prices of the drug with the manufacturer, and the provinces actually get together to do that. So when you are covered under a private drug, or a public drug plan, it can take quite a while for the drug to get approved. And in some cases, so like in Ontario, you could have a list of drugs for which you would be eligible that would be covered under the Trillium for patients who would not be over 65 or on welfare. So it is the role of the provinces to determine if there is value in the treatment, and they will make the decision if it's worth spending the money, the taxpayers' money, to reimburse the drug. So if you look at how do they determine this? Well, provinces look at agencies like CADIS or PCODER, and in Quebec it would be INES, to determine if a drug is of value. And these agencies, these health technology agencies, will look at the value and advise the government based on the data that's been submitted to them by the manufacturer. And the provinces would be sitting around the table making comments as well. That's an opportunity also for patients to provide input through our patient input. And they do a very good assessment on the value based on qualities and cost effectiveness. And they have really good expertise with respect to that. CDIAC and CAPCA make recommendations to provinces regarding cancer drugs. Those are separate bodies other than PCODER and CADIS that will make decisions if a drug is going to be listed on a provincial formulary. And again, I spoke about the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance that negotiates price with the provinces and the manufacturer, or they negotiate on behalf of the provinces with the manufacturer. And that's actually the price or the cost that the payer will pay. And those negotiations are non-transparent, and quite often they are, negotiated at a much lower price or cost than the list price. And they're based on some criteria that can be pre-established between the manufacturer and the provinces. Private insurance. Some of you may have access to private insurance plan. Most employers will provide that through their benefit, through their group benefits. They'll provide, health, dental, disability. And for most cases, private insurance will reimburse the drug at the list price, because that is the price that has been approved by PMPRB. And you can have, in some instances, negotiations between manufacturer and private insurance where they will come to an agreement and list a drug that could be under certain conditions or based on volumes or at a lower price. Individual payers. There's more and more Canadians that are paying out of pocket for their drugs, and those are potentially patients who have inadequate coverage or who are self-employed, and they will pay for the drugs, and most of the time they will pay the PMPRB list price and markup that would be added by the pharmacy. And in terms of percentage, between private, public, and individual, public plans cover approximately 40 or 41% of all Canadians. That's the number of lives. Private plans cover about 34, and 23% is estimated Canadians are paying out of pocket for some or all of their drug coverage. Sometimes they could apply for special access through Trillium or some catastrophic drug coverage, but the price that Canadians pay out of pocket on their own is quite high. Louise, now I'm going to pass it over to you to talk about price, cost, and value, because those are all three different things, and we tend to confound them. And I think this is what we're seeing right now with the regulations.
Thanks very much. Thanks to CCSN for inviting me to speak, and thanks to all of you who have decided to spend some time with us today to look at a very complicated but profoundly important issue for patients. So generally, I think it's important to think about what patients want when it comes to their health care. And what do they want in relation to drugs is access to safe, effective drugs for drugs that are necessary for their health in a timely fashion. And there are two parts to getting that. One is actually getting the drugs available for sale in this country, which is primarily the role of the federal government, and then getting them paid for, which is the role of either public, provincial, territorial payers, private insurers, or individuals themselves. And this is a very important distinction, because I think that what is being proposed by the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board is mixing up whose role is what and who has legal responsibility for what. So the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board has responsibility for price. The language is clear that what they're supposed to do is ensure that the X factory, that is the manufacturer's price, coming to the market is not excessive. And that's totally their jurisdiction. Now, the term cost means something quite different. Cost refers to the actual overall cost, dollars, that it takes to get something into our hands. It includes all kinds of other things other than just the manufacturer's price, including distribution costs, dispensing fees, administrative costs, depending on where you're getting those drugs from. So that's a completely other issue. And the cost issue is primarily the jurisdiction of the provinces and the territories, because they have responsibility for pharmacist dispensing fees, generic drug prices, and a lot of other administrative costs. The third term that's very important to understand in this context is value. And value refers to the determination of whether to cover and fund a drug from public drug budgets, rather than spending that limited amount of funding on something else, either something else for the same disease or something for a different disease, which is sometimes called an opportunity cost. And again, this is the jurisdiction of the provinces and the territories. And it's very important to understand that a price can be non-excessive or reasonable, but it still may not be of value to a particular payer, whether it's the provinces, territories, insurers, or an individual writing a check for their needs and with their limited budget. So there's a big difference between whether a price is reasonable and whether the value of writing a check for that product is worth it or not. And this is the biggest problem that I personally see with what's happening with the legislation and the changes to the patent rules. So why do I say that? I say that because the first proposed change by the Patented Medicine Review Board is to add in an economic analysis. An economic analysis based on what we call quality of life years is actually not a price question, it's a value question. And this is where the problem arises. And as Martine has said, the question of value, do I want to spend my dollars here or there, is a question for the provinces. And they get their advice about this from an organization called CADA, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health. In Quebec, they get it from an organization called INES. And then from there, with the recommendations that the provinces and territories receive from those agencies, they send it over to the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance to negotiate price. So that's the value proposition. Now, why is it that suddenly the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board has decided that it has the right to also decide value? I would argue that it has no jurisdiction whatever to do so. Now, the government says that that spending is too high in drugs. That may be true from their value perspective. They say that innovative drugs are higher priced and costlier than they were previously, and that they're being used more. There's no question that that's true. Canada pays higher drug prices than most other developed countries. I think that could be argued. Everybody seems to have their own numbers for that. I'm not going to defend or deny that one way or another. That there are limited public drug budgets, and that they will mean less overall access to drugs for Canadians. There's no question that we have to manage those limited funds as best we can. So these are assumptions that the federal government has made as to why it needs to make changes. It also says that there's a growing discrepancy between public list prices and the actual prices they're being paid because of rebates and discounts. Well, that's true. They put themselves in place, the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, to do just that. And by the way, I think that's a very good move that the governments have made. It could probably be handled a little better, but it'll grow over time. They say that there's no corresponding increase for the price of the drugs for R&D spending in Canada. I think that's a red herring. I don't think one has anything to do with the other, nor should it. And the last assumption it makes is that the federal, provincial, and territorial ministers of health need to work together to improve the 3 A's, as they're called: affordability, accessibility, and appropriate use. I don't disagree with that. The question is, whose jurisdiction is what? So as I've said, the first problem with all of this is this economic analysis. And these are the, and this is the first of the federal government's plans for change, this willingness and ability to pay based on demonstrable better health outcomes. That is the jurisdiction of the provinces already, and as I said, managed through CADF and INES and PCPA. The federal government's the question that they are asked to answer is the price that the manufacturer wants to bring this product into Canada non-excessive? And I would submit that looking at other countries that are comparable to Canada, which is the second proposal, whether this basket is right or not is another story, but looking at comparable countries and saying, I think we're paying reasonable amount, a non-excessive amount compared to those countries, makes perfect sense. But taking over the role of the provinces to decide whether they want to write checks for these things rather than other things within their budget, saying to private insurers, you're going to get, you should do this rather than this, and saying to people in Canada who write their own checks for drugs, I'm sorry, you're not going to have access to write a check for this because we've decided that this drug isn't valuable enough for you to write a check. I don't think that's the role of the federal government. It never was till now, and I don't think it can be in the future. So I think that that's a fundamental flaw with the proposed patent regulations. The government has taken the position that if they bring a drug in at a lower price than what they presently are, that the final amount that will be negotiated by the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance will also be lower. I don't think we know if that's true or it's not true. I think what we do know is that there's only a certain amount of money that a pharmaceutical company is prepared to discount its drugs. It's not going to give them away for free. Otherwise, it's not going to be in business. So whether we're really going to end up with a lower overall price, I think is highly questionable and certainly deserves much more analysis that has been done so far. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is that the manufacturers will tell us that the prices that are paid by the private insurers in some sense subsidizes the bigger discounts that they can give in the public system. That being the case, if in fact what happens here is that the private insurers' prices become much lower, then the overall amount that will be available to discount in the public system will be much less. For me, personally, I think the important thing is people need access to medications. They need to make sure they get into this country. They need to make sure that they are available to people in a timely fashion. And my question, I guess, to the federal government is, why are you rushing into this? If people are really so concerned, and if there are so many other players in this field, including CADF, PCPA, the provinces, why aren't we sitting down and having a really good discussion about this rather than pushing through a regulation that is potentially very damaging to patient access? Maybe we're all wrong about that, but if so, then what's wrong with us all sitting down and discussing it? So I'll turn it over to Martine to talk about the basket question.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Louise.
And we missed a couple of slides. Just to let people, sorry to jump in. These slides will be available in terms of slide share for download. But there's a little bit more explanation on what an economic-based factor it is, how it might or might not, and then you spoke to a lot of this already. Just let you know the slides will be available to people offline. And sorry I didn't keep up with you, Louise, but you did a great job.
Thank
Over
you.
to you, Martine.
Yes, thank you. I agree. And I must add, too, that in our initial submission to PMPRB that was done in June, where they made some presentation of what the proposed regulation would look like, we made some comments, and we had asked a number of questions, especially around the pharmacoeconomics. How are you going to determine value? Why are you duplicating efforts? If you already have CADIS and PCODA that are doing this job, what is the need for the PMPRB to be involved? And also we had questions around why use these countries? These are the new countries that they're proposing. And you can see that, a lot of them are European countries, and nothing, against European countries. I think they're great countries. I've been to pretty much all of these countries, and they're probably fairly similar to our healthcare system to some extent. But then you've got countries that are areas in Asia Pacific, Japan, Korea, and Australia that they want to introduce, and you kind of wonder why those countries. Can you explain to me why are those relevant to our baskets of countries? And we never got any answer to that. So if you look on the slide that you see on your screen right now, this is the slide that's provided by the PMPRB. This is how they look at the OECD countries and where they want to use their price comparison as the basis. So if you can see in yellow, those are the current countries that are in the baskets of countries, so the 7 countries, and they want to eliminate, as we said, U.S. and Switzerland, which are probably the countries where the prices of drugs are the highest. And I can understand why they want to look at lowering the price and how they do this. But if you look at the new countries that they want to introduce, you see in Canada is on the 3rd after Mexico in terms of price. If you look right in the middle, that's the median of the OECD. So that's where the PMPRB want to land when it comes to the new basket of countries. So they're saying, this is the median of all these countries on the list here, and it's about 20 to 22% cheaper than the current list price, or the price that they agree based on the 7 countries. So you can really see that they're kind of skewing the chart or the median price a lot more to the right, where the countries of the prices of drugs in those countries are much lower. So you can see in the arrow where those countries actually sit in terms of their price. So if you look at South Korea, for example, they're a lot cheaper than they are in Canada, about 50% of the price. So what does that mean? What happens when they do this? Well, first of all, pharmaceutical companies, as we know, pricing is a global sort of proposition. It's not just about Canada or certain countries or where their head office is. And they decide based on the environment where they're going to launch a drug. So far, companies have looked at, the value of what the pricing environment is in a particular country. So they've launched drugs in Canada fairly soon after they've developed the drug. They put a submission to Health Canada, and we're probably one of the first countries for the drug to be approved. Are we okay?
Yeah, we're good. I was just checking that we weren't on mute.
Okay. Sorry. Bill had a bit of he scared me here. So just going back to the prices of the countries, by adopting the 12 new countries, they're going to be lowering the price of entry of drugs in the Canadian market by about 20%. So what does that mean? So companies, when they look at Canada, they say, we're a good environment, we're going to launch there first. So if we're not going to have such a good pricing environment, what they may think is they can delay the launch of a drug in Canada by submitting to Health Canada at a much later date and focus on those countries where there's those where the economy is a little bit better, or they have a better pricing. Because if they launch in Canada, we are all interdependent in terms of the prices of drugs. So if you decide that you're going to launch it later in Canada because it's more favorable for you to launch earlier in another country, you may do that. So they may wait for all the 12 countries to have a price before they launch in Canada, because they may say, well, the price in Australia or Korea or Japan or Belgium is going to affect the Canadian price, so we don't know what those prices are in those countries yet. So let's wait and see what they are before we can submit to Canada and come to an agreement to the price. So by delaying or having the potential to delay drugs being launched in Canada, that's going to have a huge impact on health outcomes, because we depend on these drugs, especially, in cancer and multiple myeloma. If we don't have access to these drugs soon, well, it is a deadly disease and patients will eventually die. So that's something we don't want to have happen. So we know there's going to be winners and losers in all this. And Louise spoke a little bit about, where the savings are going to be coming from. Private payers are definitely going to be enjoying lower cost drugs. Is that good or is that bad? Well, they would say it's probably good for them, but are they going to be putting back the savings into, employee program, or are they going to be giving back, to state or to shareholder? We don't know that yet. Not to say that Health Canada should have jurisdiction over private payers and what they should do with their money, but think about this. If drugs are not coming to Canada and you're actually covered under a private drug plan, or you pay for the drug yourself, then you're at a detriment because you don't even have access to the drug. Public payers, well, they're getting savings right now through the negotiations through the PCPA, but if the money that's available to give back is reduced because of the list price being 20% lower, then pharmaceutical company may not have as much leverage to negotiate with public payers. So they also propose for drugs that are sort of low to medium priority or categories, those would be the Me Too drugs. What the current regulation proposals are is that these prices of entry would then get sort of ratchet down from the entry of the primary drug. So a little bit like generics, but this would be applied to innovator drugs. So what would be the incentive for a company to come to market with a second or third product? Well, you could argue, well, why should they? Because you already have one drug on the market. Well, not all patients are the same and respond to the same to a medication. So it's important to have, options and choice, because it could be a question of efficacy, but it could also be a question of side effects. It could be a question also of, the frequency to take the medication, which, could be a huge issue from a patient's perspective, and then affect the health outcomes of the patient. So, okay, so one of the things that is really bothering me is, and I've heard pharmaceutical companies say, and they've written in some of the op-eds in paper that that if the environment in Canada changes, they may not launch products in Canada. And we've heard this in the past. We've heard pharmaceutical companies saying that they won't launch because of certain issues, or the environment is not good enough for them in Canada. But I think this time is the right time. They're actually saying this, and it's true. And Health Canada, in their Q&A documents, they've proposed, the answer to a question with respect to companies if they would still bring their medicines to Canada if the prices were lower. And their answer is pretty, it's pretty positive if you think about it, that the prices are currently significantly lower in several countries economically compared to Canada. And companies will still bring medicines in those countries so that have either equal or better rates in Canada enjoy. And they don't think that, because the size of our market, that, patented medicines would not be launched in Canada. That's a great opinion to have, but I would like to hear it from the pharmaceutical company that, this is significant. There is definitely a risk that this could happen. And I think, something we cannot overlook, because they are businesses and they have to look at our environment just like they do, when they bring cars or televisions or iPhones to Canada. And I think this is something that, I'd like to hear more about the pharmaceutical industry and what their position is on this and what they intend to do, because I think that would inform a lot of the way we move forward. So, Louise, I'm going to turn it over to you for conclusions, and then we'll leave some time for some questions.
Thank you. So just to summarize, the first point that I dealt with was the question of the responsibility of PMPRB, and their responsibility is price, which means manufacturer's price, and whether that's excessive. The rest is over to the provinces to negotiate whether they think that they can get a good value out of the companies for the drugs through negotiations, what advice they're getting from their health technology assessment folks, both through CADIS and the people in oncology at CAPCA, and then they can decide if that's a good value proposition. It also leaves open the opportunity for an individual to decide that a product that's available is or is not of good value for them to write a check. That's not for the PMPRB to decide. It's not for the federal government to decide. So it's CADIS that has this jurisdiction. The big winners in these changes are certainly the private insurers. They're presently generally paying the patented medicine prices review price, and they won't be. My question about that is, well, will that mean that there will be savings to plan sponsors like employers and unions and even individual plan holders? If not, what will be the point of these big savings? If they're just going to go into the bottom line of private insurers, how is that actually going to enhance access or help health outcomes for Canadians? And while Martine is right, they are private companies, but the government regulates private companies. It's regulating the pharmaceutical industry. And if, in fact, the big winners here are going to be the private insurers, the federal government has said over and over again that it's going to save millions of dollars by doing this. I'm not sure how they're going to do that without the savings from the private insurers, but I'd be glad to be proved wrong. So I guess the question that I also keep asking is, will a lower entry into Canada price mean a lower negotiated price? Will it really? Or is it just meaning there'll be less wiggle room for negotiations at the provincial level? And if there is even an opportunity for a slightly lower price than we have now, how much can that really be? Because Canada has to be concerned not only about this market, but what other markets know about what price is being charged in Canada. And if they become aware that we're paying a much lower price for a drug than they're paying in another country, it's going to affect the overall health of the economy of that company. So other conclusions, and I'm going to suggest, Bill, we move to the next slide here so that I remember them all. Patients need access to innovative life-saving and life-enhancing therapies. And I don't think this approach has been proven to guarantee this enhanced access or even the level of access that we presently have. And if that's true, what's the rush to make these changes? Why don't we all sit down and convince those of us who are worried about this that in fact we don't have anything to worry about? That in fact there is a process that will be in place that's going to guarantee that there's no loss of access for us. The other thing that PMPRB has said, although they haven't written this down, is that their real problem in terms of the price of drugs is with the 10% of drugs that are what are called breakthrough drugs, new drugs, that do not have comparators everywhere else. So if that's our real problem, why don't we find a real solution to the real problem? And I would propose a dispute mechanism, resolution mechanism, that will decide what that price should be for those breakthrough drugs. So just to say before we go to questions that I think we need to ensure accountability. And Martine and I, along with others, are developing a response as we did to the pre-consultations. We welcome any of you who would like to help us develop that response, who would like to sign on to that response. In fact, who might want to take a look at it and even prepare their own separate response dealing with those things, with the things that we cover. We're happy. There's no patent on our consultation response. Meet with your MPs. If you get a chance to meet with any federal bureaucrats, politicians, the PMO's office, do it and tell them that you're concerned about this. And please, can't we sit down and have a talk more about this before we rush into anything? We haven't changed the Patent Act for 30 years. Will another year or two really make that much difference to get it right for Canadians? Write to your bureaucrats and politicians, and I would say also raise this issue with your provincial politicians, because actually I think the provinces could have something to lose in this if in fact they don't end up having the kinds of savings in their drug budgets that they're hoping to. So I guess it's Bill, over to you again.
So thanks very much, Louise, for definitely giving people an opportunity to provide some input. I'll remind folks participating that Louise and Martine are working on that submission, and I think you would welcome some input and thoughts. And in fact, some of the questions that we're starting to get on the webinar hopefully will either be answered or at least referenced in the context of that submission. We've got a couple of themes for discussion in the Q's and A's that we'll hang on. So if I don't see your questions in the question box, then we'll go back to some of these, and that's about the process and the consultations themselves, what's being proposed, the potential impacts, the alternative approaches that could be considered. We didn't spend much time on that. However, I did hear snippets of things that you'd like to hear from other stakeholders. Perhaps the role of patients is to ask the right questions in this context and not necessarily fix the whole system that, once again, is extremely complicated. But what patients are expecting from governments and other stakeholders. And then finally, and Louise, you already touched on it, what can patients and stakeholders do? So there's a good, a more technical question, but I think it's an important one. There's actually two questions from the same person. Isn't the federal government taking on this role to lay the groundwork for national pharmacare, and isn't that a good thing? And the answer is yes, and possibly, I would say. But what do you think about that, Martine?
I think those are two completely different things. Prices and national pharmacare. To me, national pharmacare is coverage for patients who fall through the cracks, who don't have access to the drugs and may not be covered under their private plans or public plans. And it is a different approach in how you deal with both. Price is completely separate from that, because if you agree that there is value, then the drug should be covered under a national pharmacare. So I would say that they're completely separate.
Yeah.
And they should not be considered together, because the jurisdiction role of the PMPRB is not to decide what drugs should be or what the national formulary should look like if we decided to go that way. That, to me, is more of a decision that sits with the provinces, but mostly with patients.
Louise?
Yes. So I think that the federal government certainly has been saying exactly that they're going to save all this money, and all that great savings is going to go into a universal pharmacare program. So my first question is, are we really going to get those savings? And I'm not at all convinced that we are. If a lot of the savings is going to come through the private insurance reduction in prices rather than the public, how are we going to convince them that they ought to put those monies into universal pharmacare? And how much are we really going to save on the public side, which is what the government can respond to? And third, as Martine says, those savings are for the provinces to decide what to do with. Has the federal government and the provinces agreed that that's where the money would go? So are we going to have enough money are the people who are going to have the money be willing to put it into this? But then the third question is, what are we talking about when we say universal pharmacare? Everybody thinks they're talking about the same thing, but in fact, I would suggest to you that everybody's talking about something different. Universal? Yep. Absolutely. Universal means everybody across this country will get the same list of drugs. I think we're pretty much all agreed that that's what universal means. However, what does it mean but what is universal? Is it universal in the sense that we will all get the best list of drugs of any of the drug coverage in this country? If it's that, I suspect it might be some of the federal private plans for their employees rather than anything we have publicly. And does it mean that in fact, given that Prince Edward Island can certainly not afford the drug budget that Ontario has or British Columbia, does it mean that in order to accommodate everybody, we're all going to have the Prince Edward Island list? Personally, I'm not so interested in that list. But I would love it if we could have everything move up so that in fact everybody could get the best possible list that they can. I just don't think that there's any proof that we're either going to have the money or the political will across this country to make that happen. And on that cheering.
Yeah, there have been webinars on the issue of national pharmacare, I think, with the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network. And as long as we've got a provincial healthcare system for delivery, and Canada is as close as it's ever been to some kind of national pharmacare program in the form of the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance that negotiates on behalf of all of those different budget holders. The next great leap to something at the federal level that would actually hold the budget and make a decision for the entire country, that's an open question. And just to close on that, what national pharmacare could look like in a federal system like the one we have is really open to debate question. And I think that we're going to be working through that. And if nothing else, this whole PMPRB discussion will prompt some of those conversations, which is a good thing, frankly. So there's a related question to some extent, and that's the PMPRB says that there are countries in the first tier of new drug distribution that have lower prices. And is this incorrect? And so there are two. The last webinar we did, we had a couple of the experts, especially Neil Palmer, who advises companies at the global level and in Canada around where to launch and how and in what sequence and in pricing. And he showed some data that called that into question. And there is actually some data that the PMPRB itself has published through the NPDUIS program, the National Prescription Drug Information Analysis, Utilization Analysis. That we need more acronyms, don't we? That showed Canada is, to Martine's point, doing pretty well now, but the countries that they're proposing to bring in, it looks like about 20% less out of 100%. We're about 65%, and sometimes it would maybe bring that down to around 40% in terms of access to new drugs that are launched. I don't know if you want to talk more about that, Martine.
Yeah, I can give you some numbers on this. So if you look at Australia and Korea, for example, they only have 30 and 50% of the drugs launched in their country compared to ours. So for every one drug that we have, they have Australia's got 0.3 drugs that are available in their country, and about 50 or half of that is available in North Korea. That's today. So if you want to bring those country and peg Canada's launches or prices to those, well, there is a risk that we're not going to see the same number of drugs launched here in Canada, and that to me is a problem.
Yeah, we've got another question around the 23% of costs that are actually paid out of pocket by individuals, and we should say that a lot of that is probably co-payments or up to like the in order to the deductible before you can actually get access to it. And then part of that, I remember I was doing some analysis in the early 2010, 2011. I wonder how much of that is actually covered by copay cards and other subsidized cards that will be tagged as out of pocket, but in fact there is a subsidy that's brought back from the manufacturers to the individuals.
Yeah.
I think the main point, though, is that 23% should be unpacked further. I don't know, Martine, what you think about that.
Yeah, I think it should because, you know I pay a certain portion of my drugs, and I do have co-pays and deductibles, and so that would be part of that 23%.
Yeah.
So could I comment on that as well?
Of course.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So you're right. Part of that is out-of-pocket co-pays and so on. We think that, although it's never been entirely analyzed, that about 10% really of Canadians are in a situation where they don't have any coverage whatsoever, that they're completely have no coverage and are paying everything out of pocket, not just co-pays and dispensing fees and so on. And I would say that if we really want to start, with a universal concept, let's at least get those 10% of people to have basic coverage that everybody else has. That would be a big start in the right direction.
And if anybody, on the line has further information or data that they want to share with us, we'd be more than happy to take a look at it and, sort of include that in our answer back to PMPRB.
Yeah. And the follow-on question from the same participant is, has the government indicated that they are trying to lower costs for that group, the out-of-pocket group? And is there some way the government could only lower public prices for out-of-pocket purchases? And if so, what do you think would be the impact on private plan coverage? I mean, there is a case study happening right now with OHIP Plus in Ontario, where the Ontario government has basically said, we're going to be first dollar coverage for all children and youth under the age of 25. Well, effectively, they're going to be negotiating the prices for what's available under that. That's one way to do it. Now, of course, they're only covering 4,400. I shouldn't say only. They're covering 4,400 drugs, which is a real expansion of healthcare in Ontario. The open question is, what happens to all of the other products that those patients need to be on, and private plans often cover between 9,000 and 12,000 drugs in total. So there's some transition issues, but I think that's a bit of a petri dish pilot project for answering part of that question.
Well, there's no question that OHIP, yes. Well, first of all, OHIP Plus is by no means a panacea. The first problem with OHIP Plus is that while you're right, it is helpful for some people for some drugs, it actually is going to be a disadvantage for people who actually had people on private plans, because the private plans are now saying, we don't cover you. If you're under 25, you go over to OHIP Plus. If OHIP Plus doesn't have that drug on your list, oh well, too bad. You can't come back to us. You're done. And I can tell you from my own family that for a baby of 10 months old who has a diaper rash, the government refused to pay for the drugs that were required for that to be fixed. So I'm not sure what drugs they've got on that list, but if diaper rash isn't on, then I'm not sure what's on.
Okay, so let's get out the creams that we need to, and we've got some great. Sorry, we've got some really good questions. One is, will there be opportunities to provide input or concerns to the presenters advocacy group? So I'm actually going to flip back to the previous slide and put your email address up there again. Martine was saying yours should be there too, but maybe a follow-up to participants. We'll shoot that around. But you've got Louise's and Martine, and you're working really hard to bring this forward. And from the same participant asking about an opportunity to provide input at the upcoming CORD-sponsored conference in Toronto on January 31st. So I'll just put a brief plug in there. Visit raredisorders.ca, and you'll see that there is the first half of the day is going to be on the PMPRB issue and pharmacare for that matter. So some of these exact questions will be brought forward. And
our sort of comments were sort of more around all drugs, and I think the drugs for rare disorders actually have their own issues as well, even more so because, the consequences of pricing could, regulation could really affect the entry or availability of drugs for rare diseases in Canada. Because quite often these drugs are not launched in many countries or at the same time as they are in Canada, just because of the cost. And so I think the implications for rare disease is probably even greater. And yes, I think that the core conference will help to address that.
And I just like to say that we should be careful, because there are many cancers that are rare diseases. There are many like life-threatening and very serious quality of life diseases that are defined as rare. And so it's not, it's not that we're dealing with something that's easily manageable. These rare diseases are not manageable without a lot of help with medications, and it's very hard to get manufacturers to want to get into this area in any case. And now we're going to really disincent them from wanting to research and manufacture and provide drugs and biologics for rare diseases. That's very unfortunate.
And the introduction of the health economic factor will be a detriment to drugs for rare diseases.
Absolutely. So, it already is.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's a lot of things that the panelists have said in terms of this could be an obstacle, this could be an issue, here's an opportunity, and there's some great ideas coming forward in the questions as well. I'll put in one final plug for that January 31st conference, and I understand you're coming, Martine. I'm involved in helping set it up. And one thing that we've seen Health Canada and the PMPRB do is come up with numbers that they're hoping will apply in Canada based on what they've seen happen in other jurisdictions, and say it happened like this in Japan, and so we can do it here, or Europe, and with global numbers and data around investments, et cetera, or launch times. What I think we're going to try to do on the 31st is run a couple of case studies and look at rare disorder drug, look at an oncology drug, and look at more common chronic disease, for example, diabetes, and just think about either how stakeholders, reviewers, or manufacturers would manage that through the proposed new regulations, because that's actually putting the rubber to the road, as opposed to just saying, hey, if we put these regulatory signals out, this is what's going to happen because X, Y, and Z happened over there. I really think that's a gap in terms of how these consultations have been held so far. We haven't seen that happen, and so encourage everyone on the line to try to come to that. We've got 1 to 2 final questions, one around R&D, and this is more of an idea, maybe you could take it away. There was a basket of 7 countries, and that was chosen based on the level of R&D investment in those countries. But that never happened. Is this the case, et cetera? Well, it actually did happen that the manufacturers hit the numbers that they were supposed to hit, or that they'd agreed to hit for the first, quite quickly, and for the first decade until around the mid 2000s, but then, or the early 2000s, and then it went down from there, and now we're sitting around 4.5% of R&D to sales. However, the definition of R&D has been stuck in time as well. So if you look at some of the more recent data, the numbers, it doesn't look like it's quite at 10%, but we're often comparing apples to oranges here. So I think the main point there is get the data right. But the idea that the participant has is, can we in this update somehow tie a requirement for R&D investment if in legislation, if other things happen?
I mean, I think that's a great idea. And, if you don't like the definition, or the definition doesn't meet the environment of today, then let's change the definition. Research has evolved. More and more different types of bodies are getting involved in research. I can speak from Myeloma Canada. We have a research network that actually does clinical trial and gets sponsors by different industry, and my understanding is that money doesn't count to the money that's invested in research. So let's redefine, and that's something I will put some more thinking around. Thank you for that suggestion.
Excellent. So
Well,
then one
I
final
guess-
question, because we're bumping up on 2 o'clock, but go ahead, Louise, do you want to weigh in, and then we'll...
I was just gonna say that, first of all, I think things have really changed in terms of how decisions about R&D are made internationally. So I'm just not entirely sure it would be entirely fair to tie it to R&D. And the other thing I would say is, you know, I think R&D to some extent certainly requires a friendly environment for drugs to become accessible once the research is done. So why don't we work on that, and then hopefully the R&D, where it's appropriate, will follow.
Yeah. So on that note, we're actually past 2 o'clock, so I'm going to be respectful of people's time. I'm sorry we didn't get to every question, but I know who the last questioner is, and so I'll get in touch with you separately. I've been good today. I haven't actually identified anyone. Normally I call you out by name, so thanks for, I don't know what happened. I got more careful or something. On behalf, you know, I just have to say one more plug for the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network. Thank you for hosting things like this and becoming a real forum for exchange. And this webinar will be available on SlideShare and through the SurvivorNet YouTube channel as well. And thank you, Louise and Martine, for taking the time to contribute your expertise and thoughts and considerations today. You know, this opportunity to actually be engaged and to make a difference, you know, it so relies on people like you, Louise, who have managed to effect such change on important health issues for I won't even say how long. And Martine, you've been at this for almost, you know, a long time as well. So
Both sides.
Both sides. So all sides, we can say. So thank you both. And over to you, Allison, to close us out.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone.